Well, let's pick it up in Genesis chapter 9 and continue in our study in the book of Genesis. Slide 179. Following their departure from the great ship, Noah thought he had the most brilliant idea. Why? Because he was a man of the soil, of the ground. Perhaps it was so moist after the water receded and then perfect to plant a vineyard. But what happens next? He got drunk with his own wine. In fact, he was so drunk that somehow he lost his clothes and lay naked in his tent. Commentators, though, are not sure if he was passed out or nude or whether he had plans with his wife that evening. No one really knows. Ham, one of his sons, the father of the Canaanite people, Ham was the evil son out of the three. Shem and Japheth decided to cover their dad with a blanket while Ham was having a ball with the whole thing. Honoring his father was apparently no big deal for Ham, regardless of Noah's bad decision and witness. Once Noah sobered up and found out what his two sons had done, he cursed Ham, H-A-M. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves. Will he be to his brothers. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. Very strong and terrible words to hear from one's own father. In any event, Noah cursed his grandson, and so on. Some thinkers hold that the verbiage, sees his father's nakedness, might imply Ham's intent of incest. In Leviticus, if that was so, in Leviticus 18, this phrase might have to do with incest, which was strongly condemned in the Mosaic law, not to mention natural law. Like homosexual incest is just wrong all the way around, if not worse. So it could also refer to Ham having seen his father's private parts, if you will, and in turn made it a laughing matter. However, if this was the case, where was Noah's wife during all of this? One interpretation of justice in this whole issue is called the Talionic principle. You have that on slide 180. And in this case, Noah's youngest son sinned, and in turn a curse was placed on Ham's youngest son, who would be Canaan. Moving on, 181. In all, Noah blesses the Lord of Shem and makes Canaan a slave to both Shem and Japheth. You have that in verses 26 and 27. In summary, verses 8 through 17, God has spoken about the future. In verses 25 through 27, you see Noah talking about the future. Moving on to Genesis 10 on 182. Some of the notes there, you have the table of nations. Interestingly, verse 1 begins with the sons of Noah in order. But then in the following verses, the order is reversed. This is probably due to the listing peoples or listing of nations. You have the offspring from Japheth. They are peoples, plural, of which 7 again are identified, which are the most remote from Palestine. By the way, Palestine was, there was no Palestine prior to the 1st century, contrary to popular opinion, including your Bible maps. In the back of your Bible, it says Palestine before Christ. There was none. That's a Roman description of the Jews. So the Palestinians or Palestinians did not exist prior to Christ. As for most of the other nations, scholars hold that they represent the groups in the Mediterranean islands, including Asia Minor. In the book of Ezekiel, you recognize and read of Magog and Meshesh. Javan represents the ancient Greeks or the Ionians. Madai, M-A-D-A-I, represents the Medes. Remember the Medo-Persians, you read about them in the book of Daniel. And then the Kittim, K-I-T-T-I-M, has been associated with Cyprus, while Rodanim, R-O-D-A-N-I-M, reflects the islands of Rhodes, which would be southwest of Turkey. Nimrod, the great warrior, Nimrod finds, of course, Babylon, Erech, and Akkad, A-K-K-A-D, all south and southwest of Egypt. Notice here that Sargon the Great established the capital of his Mesopotamian kingdom, Akkad, at the city of Agade, Agade, also known as Akkad, in about 2340 BC. Sargon's Akkadian Empire, if you haven't taken classes on the Old Testament survey, you should. Sargon's Akkadian Empire spread from that area between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River of Lebanon. Remember, we read about them in the book, or in chapter, what was it? 3, I believe it was. Yeah. By 2125, the Sumerian city of Ur, remember that's where Abraham came from, had risen up and overthrown Akkad. Okay, moving on to Genesis 10. You have continuing genealogy there, a bunch of different names that you can read on your own. Slide 185. The 4th generation is traced only through Cush, C-U-S-H. And this is where the Gentiles come from. Most of the people in chapter 6, verses 6 through 20, are Gentiles. And that includes the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, and Somalia. Shem fathered 4 sons, and verses 21 through 32 are most important, which is why they are last, because we discover the name Eber, or Aber, Eber, which is Hebrew. So in that sense, it's been speculated that perhaps the words, quote, the earth was divided in Peleg's time, verse 25, might refer to a twofold division between these Semitic groups. Or it might suggest that Peleg is simply tied somehow to the old Akkadian world, or Akkadian Empire, meaning canal, C-A-N-A-L. If that was the case, then Peleg was involved in construction of irrigation canals, or canals, or channels, which would be extraordinary given this time of early history. Some speculate that this might be a hint of the Babel story, the story of Babel, and then the Tower of Babel, where people were divided from one another, and so on. Geographically, Genesis 10 covers a huge area ranging as far as East Persia, which is Alam, or Elam, to Ethiopia, which would refer to Cush, and north to the Aegean Sea. And they call that an old Catharim, and west toward Egypt and Libya. All this data is on slide 185. Lots of information there, so look at that. Genesis 11, Tower of Babel. You have that on slide 186. You have a little artist's rendition of the Tower of Babel. Therefore, its name was Babel, or Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth and scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. That's, of course, Genesis 11, verse 9. When does this date back? 3,500 to about 3,000 BC. To build a city, not a settlement, and such a tower would take years. Of course, no later than 2,400 BC. If we have a common ancestry, why not a common language? That's what some people are asking. Well, recent linguistics, scholars of language, have claimed that all the languages of the world can now prove that they derive from one common language. Guess what? An ancient Semitic language, which is exactly this region of the world that we are talking about right now. So a common language was the case at this point prior to the division at the Tower of Babel. I'm Swedish and German and Norwegian, and when you look at ancient maps, my neck of the woods would be Germanica on the map. We have the Scandinavians. And then, of course, you look at South America. You look at other portions of the Far East, the Middle East, throughout Europe and so forth. All of the languages of the world can be traced down according to recent linguistic studies, and I find that very interesting, because you're not just going to have people pop out out of nothing, from nothing, speaking a different language. So the whole world described in chapter 11 was spelled out in chapter 10. But how do we solve the fact that in chapter 10 of Genesis we read of a division between the descendants of Noah, which might involve languages as well? Well, you have here point 1, either we have a contradiction between chapters, two chapters, or 3, this is simply well, it refers to dialects of a local language. Chapter 11, languages refer to an international language being confused into many languages. So there you have it. Final point there. Others suggest that the chapter should have been listed after chapter 11 because you have the word Shinar, which refers to the ancient land of Babylonia, and concerning Ziggurat, which is a 7 staggered tower, if you will. Then you have on slide 189 the city of Ur, or the land of Ur, U-R, which is where Abraham came from. Remember, he was called from the land of Ur. Guess what? The father of the Jewish people was a Gentile. He came from the land of Ur, and he, of course, gave birth to the first Jew, and we'll get to that soon. But remember this, the land of Ur was Gentile. So the father of the Jewish people was a Gentile. Doesn't that make you feel special? Slide 190, I love sharing that with rabbis when I'm in Jerusalem. Slide 190, you have the ancient way of the alphabet in Sinai, 1500 BC, Canaan, the Phoenician, Old Greek, etc. And when I was studying Greek years ago, I found a book on Egyptology and other ancient languages. And I remember sitting in a Greek class learning alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, u, and just going on. And all of a sudden, I got very curious because I'm Swedish and I'm reading an English textbook learning Greek. That's like being 3 times removed from reality. And if you look at slide 190, if you look there at the top left, you have Sinai, 1500 BC. Notice there it kind of looks like a cow head or some sort of an animal with 2 horns. Well, eventually you just go from Canaan, 1000 BC, up to Phoenician to Old Greek. Eventually, this little cow-looking face is flipped around where it turns into a Roman A, or Greek alpha. And so, for me, when I'm studying something, I always try to go back to the original, like where in the world did A or alpha come from? So you have a little picture or an inscription of the ancient alphabet there. All can be traced back to Sinai. Moving on to slide 191, you have Genesis 11. There is nothing wrong in wanting to build a city. Nothing wrong in wanting to build a city at all. But it seems to imply to join Cain. Remember Cain in chapter 4, verse 17. The sin is not to build a tower reaching to the heavens, but rather to make a name for themselves. We should never strive to do this in ministry either. We preach Christ crucified and Him alone through grace alone. We don't elevate ourselves and so on. We push His name alone. Now, name means reputation in Genesis 11. So they wanted to erect a huge building and honor themselves and sort of memorialize their greatness. They were a self-praised and very prideful people. Remember, pride goes before a fall. Notice the emphasis on seeing. The Lord came down, so to speak, to see the city and tower. It's clearly a case of irony to see the self-inflated fools wanting to build a skyscraper. In turn, as they're building a skyscraper, the Lord comes down. You gotta love it. Slide 192. Interestingly, is that God does not halt this construction while it's going on, while it's in progress, nor does He destroy the tower. Instead, He judges the people. How? Their language, not their construction. He could have judged them with an illness or made them unable to build, blown up the tower. Instead, He judges their tongues. This all gives rise to the word Babel or Babel. You know, someone's just babbling. You don't understand what I'm saying, and so forth, which in the Hebrew means to confound or confuse. So what's this guy babbling about? Remember, Paul is in Athens, and on top of Mars Hill, reasoning with the Stoic philosophers and the Epicureans. I'll be teaching Introduction to Philosophy this fall. And remember, they're saying, what is this guy babbling about? There it is, babble. He's just babbling, which means to confound or confuse in Hebrew, hence the Tower of Babel. I find it sad to see that the Babylonians, in turn, calling their city Babili or Babilani, which means the gate of the gods. How pagan is that? This is clearly reflected in later Greek Babylon. Then you have Shem's descendants in slide 194, Genesis 11. The Shemites is another 10-generation genealogy that stretches all the way from Shem to Terah. Who is Terah? Father of Abraham. As for historical adequacy, the names repeated, including identified places, demonstrates biblical reliability. In other words, you have Zerug to Sarugi, and Nahor to Nakur, which is northwest Mesopotamia. That's on slide 194. Yet, as we will see, Abram, before he became Abraham, Abram came from the land of Ur, which is south Mesopotamia. Ur of the Chaldees. You are of the Chaldeans. Recent discoveries in archaeology has revealed a strong movement of Terahites coming from Terah, the father of Abraham, which links support for Abraham being connected to lower Mesopotamia and also being the patriarchs of northern Mesopotamia. Now, these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, there it is, Nahor and Haran fathered Lot. That's in Genesis 11:27. Moving on to slide 196, you have the call of Abraham. And what happened there? Well, he was, of course, faithful. God told him, go. Where? Just go. I'll tell you where. We'll get to that point in a minute. But what can be said about the land of Ur? You are Ur. 4000 BC. The land of Ur, according to the Bible, was the hometown of Abraham. That's on slide 187. Ur is mentioned only 4 times in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. Remember, Torah is the first 5 books. The Tanakh is the entirety of the Old Testament. Ur had an occupation dating as early as 4000 BC. That's 6,000 years ago. Ur is the modern-day Iraq. Many commentators agree on that. Iraq, or ancient Ur, has undergone excavation on and off since the 1800s. What's the significance here? What points can we develop? At least 6. These discoveries also show that Ur was a powerful city-state prior to its fall. Abraham's ancestral home is thus confirmed as a historical place. The infamous, quote-unquote, royal tombs of Ur, dating approximately 2500 BC, reveal gold and silver objects of awesome creativity and beauty. Number 4, archaeologists conclude that these tombs were constructed before the life of Abraham. Number 5, a Sumerian-occupied people is also depicted in this account. In all, point 6 in Genesis 11:31, Genesis 15:7, Nehemiah 9:7, and the book of Acts in the New Testament, chapter 7, 2 through 4, we see that Abraham's father relocated to Haran, perhaps because Ur's decline and fall during Abraham's life. Okay, on slide 198, you can see Nineveh at the top. If you drop down all the way towards the center, you have Babylon right above Borsippa. And of course, go all the way down at 5 o'clock, you have the land of Ur. So Nineveh at the top, Ur at the bottom, 11 and 5 o'clock. You have, of course, what's funny is when the critics of the Bible, they laugh, or used to laugh, about the city of Ur. We never heard of the land of Ur except for the Bible. Well, if you look at slide 199, who's laughing now, right? They uncovered quite a bit of archaeology. And you can see the ziggurat in the back of 199, little close-up on the ziggurat as opposed to a pyramid. You can see a ziggurat here on slide 200. The standard of mosaic is made of red limestone. The picture describes a time of peace. You can see that on 201. A few slides for you. What else can we say here? Slide 202. The first word that God speaks to Abraham is leave. Without any special revelation, there's no Old Testament in his hand. He doesn't have a scroll. Imagine listening just to leave, and then he actually does. Not quite knowing where he's going yet, no wonder Abraham is listed as one of the heroes in the Hall of Faith. So why did he leave? Three things. Or what did he leave? His country, his people, his father's household. No small call when you don't know where you're going. In turn, God gives Abraham a series of promises. Now, this is where replacement theology or ancient supersessionism comes in. A, he makes certain promises to his offspring, and B, his reputation, and C, various blessings. In turn, the reputation that he has promises or will rather achieve, not in a prideful way, just listen, you are so to speak, my guy, just leave, be faithful. The word reputation there promises a stark contrast to the folk or the people, the folks at the Tower of Babel. Remember, they were seeking to make a name for themselves. Here God is saying, look, Abraham, I'm going to make a name for you. They sought to make their own name great at Babel, while God sought to elevate the name of Abram later on to be Abraham. If we seek his righteousness, remember, all of these things will be added unto you. And amen to that. At this point now, slide 203, Abraham is about 75 years old. As far as we know, this is the first time that we have in recorded history that God involves himself with the life of Abraham. After God says, leave, Abraham quickly responds, so Abraham left. That's all we know. In verse 1, God speaks to Abe. And in verse 7, he reveals himself to him. Next, Abraham lives in the regions of Canaan, which is ancient Israel. Remember, the Canaanites were there. When you go to Israel and you're at the Western Wall where the Jews pray, you have the flooring where the rabbis and the Jews are praying. If you make a special appointment, you can actually go below. It's called the Rabbi Tunnel. So you have the Western Wall, here's the floor, and here's where you see the Jews pray, and Gentiles. This wall actually goes down further. So if you can make your way through the Rabbi Tunnels, and if you are scared of the dark or whatever, no worries. There's lights, there's AC running through the building, through these little tunnels and walkways. It's not like you're crawling, you can walk. You actually get down below here, first century Western Wall flooring. This is where Jesus would have walked. So when you go to Israel today, you're standing up here. Well, this would be sort of like a rooftop, but this floor didn't exist during that time. Having said that, where you're standing, Jesus would have looked up at you. Once you get down to the bottom of the Rabbi Tunnels, because the Western Wall continues down, as you're walking at the very, very bottom, they've cut open the flooring or the ground, and put like some type of a glass, super thick, Tuff-X plastic or whatever, and lights shining even further down, and you see there's rubbish and rocks. That is the Canaanite floor. The ancient Canaanites, when they got there, that is sort of like the debris of that city before it got overthrown. All right, that's a side note. So Abraham lives in the regions of Canaan, which is Shechem, and then, of course, Bethel or Bethel. God makes another promise. To you and your offspring, that means your offspring alone, I will give you this land of Canaan. What about ethnic cleansing? Why would God send his people in there and destroy the Canaanites? Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to find out that the Canaanites were very, very evil. When you go to Megiddo in Israel, I will probably go the next fall. You're free to come with me. We don't use a tour guide. I lecture. I do theology, apologetics, archaeology on site. And you'll get stuff that you normally don't hear. They're not just memorized paragraphs. We'll read a chapter of the Bible, grab a glass of water, and off you go on a bus. We don't do it like that. We take our time and really try to milk every site and its significance. But the interesting thing is at Megiddo, where Solomon has set up shop, you'll see archaeologists having dug really deep, and you look down and you see a Canaanite altar of I believe it's unhewn stone, just natural stone put together in the shape of a circle. Well, guess what? That's where they would sacrifice virgins. Those are the Canaanites that we're talking about. So when God says, listen, go in, destroy these people, don't marry these people, and it's equivalent, Amalekites and Hittites, etc. They were like rabbis infested dogs, Do not intermingle because you'll turn pagan and they will corrupt you. Nonetheless, at this point, Abraham had no children at all. Yet he's being promised, to you and your offspring I will give you this land. So he knew. Now keep that in mind as we get to the Abraham and Isaac story. All right, summary. In conclusion, we have God speaks, Abraham listens and heeds the divine spoken journey, so to speak. He's just going. He's being faithful. Then God reveals himself to Abraham. In response, Abraham does what? Worships the Lord. The chapter begins with a promise to make Abraham's name great and concludes with Abraham calling on the name of the Lord. Very beautiful man of God. But just like Moses killed a man, struck the rock, and misrepresented the Lord, Abraham was far from perfect. Listen, some of these stories are for our learning. These ancient patriarchs, the apostles, the church fathers, if you will, none of them were perfect. So what can we learn from the life of Abraham and Sarai? Abram and Sarai, and that's of course Sarah, in Genesis 12. You have that account settled in Egypt. Abram heads over to Egypt due to famine in the land, yet this is not what God had told him to do. This is his first act of disobedience. All right? He says, I'm going to Egypt. There's a famine in the land. What did God tell him to do? What would you have done? Waiting for the Lord to speak in between his moments of silence? God says, leave, head that way. And then there's famine in the land. God is not saying anything. He's watching you. Are you going to head that way or not? Well, no. He makes a left turn and heads to Egypt, his first act of disobedience. I think most of us would have done the same thing. He's waiting for the Lord to speak in between God's moments of silence. Hears nothing. Would it seem logical to head to Egypt due to famine in the land? Well, yeah. Maybe at this moment he became a deist. Maybe God is sleeping. He's not going to speak to me. This makes sense. So I got to go to Egypt. There's no famine there yet. His second act of disobedience is he lies while in Egypt. With the Egyptians, he tells the Egyptians that, his wife is his sister. It's a partial lie. After all, they were close, akin. Was his lie intentional? In one way, yes, because he should have said it was his wife, regardless of their closeness. After all, they were married. Another problem is that he asked Sarah to lie as well, claiming to be his sister. This behavior is rooted in Abraham's certainty that the Egyptians will abduct Sarai or Sarah. If he doesn't lie. So he's not really trusting the Lord here. What made him so sure? God didn't tell him to do so. When God is certain of our future, we should be certain of his plan for us as well, whether he's quiet or not. Sadly, the lie of calling her a sister would in turn make her vulnerable. As a sister, he would be left alone. As married, he thought he'd be killed. As her brother, the two would be left alone, setting aside her being even more vulnerable. In fact, in Genesis 12:10 verses 20, the Pharaoh takes Sarah into his house. This is, according to some, actual adultery, in that it means there were relations between Sarah and the Pharaoh. That's what some are suggesting. When you say he took her into his house, it means bedroom. Now you got a case of adultery, all because of a lie. If that version or interpretation is correct. Why all this? Because Abraham's disobedience. He was a faithful man, but in this case, his faithlessness begat a lie and another lie and ended up in worse evils. Genesis 13, here is a further description of Abraham's wealth. He is expelled from the land of Egypt, of course. Abraham is now back on track, traveling northward as he was told by the Lord to do. Thus he traveled northward and passed through Negeb and up to the hills located between Bethel and Ai. Ai. We're going to hear about that a little later on. Ai is where Abraham built the altar to the Lord, the first altar. As the family grew, we see the herdsmen full of strife, competing for fresh pasture. So Abraham, of course, and Lot, they separate. We see the very selfish nature of Lot, L-O-T, in these passages, in that he chose the luscious land by the Jordan. You know, if you're at the Dead Sea, and you're on the Israeli side, you have the Qumran to your left, Masada to your right, you're staring at the Dead Sea. Right on the other side, you got Jordan. And apparently in these days, Jordan was all luscious and green, whereas you had like the equivalent of Barstow behind you. Barstow is a place out here in the desert on the west coast. We make jokes about Barstow. It's as close as you can get to hell, literally. It's just unbearably hot, not too much growth of anything, and it's just sort of a ghost town with a few gas stations and farmers. In any event, Abraham and Lot separate. Lot says, I want the luscious land by the Jordan, because it's being filled, or I should say watered by the Jordan River. So it's very luscious down there. We see the opposite in Abraham, who offers Lot his first shot. You take your choice. On the other hand, having experienced much famine, probably because of drought, it's no wonder that Lot would choose the well-watered Jordan. He's going to take his family. It's survival time. We just got over this famine. You know, Abraham just came from Egypt, finally going back to the land of Canaan. Not to mention that it was watered again like the Garden of Eden, which is a very interesting comparison. Then the Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. As the Lord speaks and promises this land to Abraham and his offspring forever, we have grounds to reject ancient supersessionism or replacement theology, also called fulfillment theology. Here it's claimed that because the Jews rejected Jesus as Messiah, all of the Old Testament promises made to the Jews are now null and void. In other words, God is done with the nation of Israel. In turn, these Old Testament prophecies or promises made to the Jews has now been passed on to the Gentiles, on to the church, and the church is now called the new Israel, or the spiritual Israel. Now, if you just listen to this, can you imagine John teaching this, Peter, Matthew, Paul? In Romans 9, 10, 11, I think it says exactly the opposite. It's a Gentile theology. It's not a Jewish theology. Christianity is a Jewish faith. It's not a Gentile faith. The first 11 generations of priests at the Church of Jerusalem were all Jewish. None of them held to this belief. However, as Gentile theologians began to write on the Bible, this doctrine was introduced by various church fathers. Various churches had removed some of these doctrines because of the possibility of anti-Semitism. And I'll tell you one thing. If all Christians were into replacement theology and we changed our eschatology as far as God dealing with the nation of Israel. Now, most replacement theologians don't believe that God is completely done with the nation of Israel. I know Orthodox priests that don't believe that. Others say, you know what, they're doomed to hell. They killed Christ, and, you know, there we go. But our eschatology, the study of the last age, I don't call it days. The last age began at the day of the ascension. Okay? So one day after Jesus ascended to go back to the Father and the Holy Spirit, that's when the last age began. I don't like the last days. It was the last age. The final age has been going on for 2,000 years. But if our eschatology or view of the last days or last age excludes any importance with the Jews, they would literally be, sitting ducks. So because of evangelical Christianity and this hype on God restoring the nation of Israel and Messiah is going to come back and all of these things that we believe in, secular Jews and religious Jews are in a safer spot than had we all embraced supersessionism or replacement theology. God has done, all those promises go to me. But the important thing is here, I will make this promise to you, Abraham, to you and your descendants forever. It's an unconditional promise. Now, he makes conditional promises too. If you do this, that'll happen. If you don't, this will happen. But this is an unconditional promise. In slide 212, you can read Israel, Gentiles, and replacement theology. I'm not going to get into that. That's just side notes. And you can go on till about 213. I will pick it up again in 214 because we don't have too much time. Various Jews are literally bashed in much of the writings of the early church. Some made a connection that perhaps this led to some of the anti-Semitism being against Jewish people that we've seen throughout the world, including the church. You have pictures of Hitler standing hand in hand, shaking hands with priests. What's that all about? Regardless of opinion, it seems fair to conclude, like I mentioned, that Israel is much safer without this doctrine floating around in the church and the academy. That's not to say that it's a false doctrine. I don't believe in replacement theology. Nonetheless, the promise includes land and offspring. This is a clear divine promise regardless of obedience of the Israelites. If the Israelites or the descendants of David had to be faithful, look, they killed the prophets, they killed Messiah, but my sins killed Messiah as well. Your sins did as well. So when Jesus says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou who killest the prophets, yes, they did. And if it was Sweden or Germany or Norway, my neck of the woods, we probably would have killed them too. But maybe we didn't. That's beside the point. The point is this, that the promise includes land of Israel, the land of Canaan that became Israel, and offspring. Of course, that's during Moses' time. Moses dies and never gets to enter the land. Joshua goes in like a warrior and conquers the Canaanites. That's the land that God is promising to them forever, for all generations, regardless of the Israelites' obedience. So it's not based on their obedience that they're going to lose the land or gain the land. It's just a clear promise. It seems to be unconditional. Now, in all, imagine hearing all this while you still are childless. He hasn't had a boy or a daughter yet. As Abraham locates next Hebron, also known as Kiriath Arba, the words that he pitched his tents by the oaks of Mamre most likely refers to one of Abraham's allies named Mamre the Amorite, who's mentioned in Genesis 14:13. It is therefore believed that the oaks of Mamre was named after him. Next you see Abraham saving Lot, who separated himself from Abraham. Abraham's got to go in and save him. Genesis 14 is next, where Abraham rescues his nephew Lot. You see the Nuzi tablets at the Semitic Museum at Harvard University on 217. The Nuzi tablets were found shortly before World War II, just to the east of Mari and the Euphrates River. Remember, one of the springs that came out of the Garden of Eden. There are several thousand Kunay tablets dating back 1500 BC, which confirms many of the customs that are mentioned in the Bible. The above image is provided by courtesy of the Semitic Museum at Harvard. I had to put that in there. What's the point here? What about biblical significance? The custom of childless couples having the eldest servant inherit one's wealth. In other words, having a servant heir is confirmed by the Nuzi tablets. Just like we will see, this practice is mentioned by Abraham in reference to Eliezer in Genesis 15:2. The custom of birthright sales, selling your birthright, is also confirmed, as is mentioned later on with Esau and Jacob in Genesis 25, verse 31. The custom of household idols, idol worship, is also confirmed. Note the account of Rachel having stolen these from her father Laban in Genesis 31:19. Same thing there. Remember, she stole her pagan idols. You see that in the Nuzi tablets. So during this Abrahamic time and the practices that come next, some of these are mentioned in thousands of these ancient clay tablets known as the Nuzi, N-U-Z-I tablets. That's slide 218. All right, Genesis 14. In this section, we discover three main issues. Lot's abduction. 2, Abraham rescues Lot. And then, of course, Abraham encounters two kings, one from Sodom and one from Salem. Salam, Shalom, Shalom, or Salam, Jerusalem. Salem, peace. So Shalom in Hebrew means peace, is directly linked to Salem or Salem. In Arabic, they say Salam. They don't say Shalom. They say Salam. Here you have a very early indication of Jerusalem, 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 the city of peace. Of course, there will be no peace in Jerusalem until the Prince of Peace arrives again. Lot, having been taken captive by 4 kings in alliance, having invaded the Jordan Valley, remember that's where he wanted, it was well watered, etc. These 4 kings defeated 5 kings in the area, so very strong patrol. So Lot is now settled at Sodom, not the best place to be. Abraham sets out to rescue his nephew Lot with a small, tiny army. They succeed and also recover a great deal of plunder. Why? Because of Abraham? No, because God was his defender. God was behind him, just like you see in the life of David. It's interesting to note that Abraham and his army is actually able to overthrow these abductors. Also, sit down later on with 2 kings, as if there's the respect level. I will make your name great. I will defend you. I will take care of you, Abraham. We also notice that Abraham does not force to achieve the purposes of God. He's just sort of floating with the Lord, which is how it should be. In Genesis 14, verses 13 through 16, is the first mention of Abraham the Hebrew. The Hebrew. Abraham the Hebrew. Even though he wasn't a Jew, he's referred to as the Hebrew in the Tanakh. If any one of you have been in the area of what's called Tel Dan, T-E-L, Tel Dan, then you've experienced the ancient city of what's called Laish, mentioned in chapter 14, verse 14. I love Tel Dan, very nice place. In any event, maybe we can see that together in the future. In all, we see Abraham being faithful in that he relies on God and not on a military force. The words, quote, trained men in verse 14:14 indicates a military type of combat training experience. So they were trained in battle. Then you have the king of Sodom said to Abraham in verse 21 through 24, give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. But Abraham said to the king of Sodom, with raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord, talking to a pagan king here, the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, tell me he's not bold, that I will accept nothing belonging to you. What can we derive from those verses? Well, let's move on to slide 223. Melchizedek, remember Christ came sort of like a type, a fulfillment of the Melchizedek priesthood. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. We don't know that much about him, yet he was, number one, a priest of the Most High, and that's exactly what Abraham says here, to the king of Sodom. With raised hand I've sworn an oath, God the Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, not even a shoestring, so that you will be able to say, I made Abraham rich. See, the Lord is making him rich. He continues in verse 24, I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten, and the share that belongs to the men who went with me, to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share. That's it. He could have totally taken advantage of the king of Sodom. So, moving on now. A priest of the Most High that Abraham is talking about. That's where we get the word Melchizedek from. Salem, again, Salam, Salem, Shalom, Salam is a shortened version of Shalom, peace, including Jerusalem. Thus, a kingly priest in the lineage is what you see here in Melchizedek. It's actually tied to the city of Jerusalem before King Saul. So you have a kingly priest lineage that's tied to Jerusalem before King Saul, who was the first king of Israel. Very important. In the book of Hebrews, we read of Jesus coming through the kingly Davidic line, the line of David, in the order of Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. All of this implies a certain or sure description that Melchizedek and the later Jesus the Christ, the kingly priestship, was superior to the coming Levitical priesthood that you read in the book of Leviticus. So this is superior to the Levitical priesthood. Notice also how Melchizedek, his acknowledgement in that God is on the throne. He's the possessor of heaven and earth. Indeed, the earth is God's footstool. The whole earth is his temple. Thus, God's authority is all over the earth. We will pick it up next in slide 224, and hopefully you're catching along. I know we're covering a lot of information, and we will get through this. Talk to you soon. Shalom.